Thank you. Welcome everybody. A great turnout for what I'm sure will be a great talk. This is Professor James Renwick, Professor of the School of Geography, Environment and Earth Sciences, so that's almost everything, at Victoria University of Wellington. We really are lucky, not only is our professor really eminent and has been on the global stage in discussions of the climate and all implications arising from present changes in that area, but it's just such a timely opportunity for us to have a bit of an update for us all. Not only did Wellington declare a climate change emergency yesterday, which you actually managed to sort of somehow or other get yourself in the Dom Post for, so you're probably responsible for either the emergency or the declaration, I'm not sure. But also, of course, we have the zero carbon bill, which many of us are thinking about at the moment, and indeed submissions on that proposed piece of legislation are due quite soon, in very much mid-July. So I hope to use my chair-type prerogative in asking a few questions about what we should be putting in that submission. But anyway, look, it's fantastic having you. It's really timely. We all need updating, and some of us need more than updating. I took a sneak preview of your first slide, which is Climate 101, and I personally will be benefiting from that. So thanks very much for coming along, and we really look forward to it. James will talk till approximately 1 o'clock, or just shortly around there, and then we'll be taking questions. We have lots of off-site people, really lots, and so I'm sure there'll also be questions from remotely, which we'll obviously give equal time to. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and kia ora koutou. What a great introduction. And hello to the people on the other side of the camera over there. Yes, so climate emergency, a lot happening in the political sphere and a lot happening with public activism around climate change. That's really increased dramatically in the last year, pretty much since two things happened. One, Greta Thunberg in Sweden started her climate strike all by herself, an unknown 15-year-old student who's now spoken to pretty much every world leader you could imagine. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change put out its 1.5 degree report a little less than a year ago now. And the way that was couched in the media releases was very interesting. It was much more direct, I would say, about risks and about what we need to do to stop the warming. So it was, the science hasn't really changed for quite a long time now, but the way it's being discussed, even by bodies like the IPCC, has the sense of urgency certainly ramped up quite a bit. But as you've just heard, my very first slide is this Climate Change 101. If you've heard any talk by me in the last 5 years, you've probably seen this slide before, but so you may know it all, but I do like to do this to begin with, just so that we all understand what's going on. So, all of the energy in the climate system comes from the sun. I don't think that's a mystery to anybody. Two things about that. One is, one way to change the climate on the Earth is to change the amount of sunlight. If the sun brightens up, it gets warmer. If the sun becomes dimmer, it gets cooler, and that's the main driver of the ice ages. But the other thing is that sunlight is absorbed by the Earth, not by the atmosphere. The air around us is not warmed by the sun at all. Well, there is one exception, but basically the air is completely transparent to sunlight, and it's the Earth that is warmed by the sun. So the Earth is warmed, so it radiates energy, much the same sort of energy our bodies radiate, heat energy, infrared. And that's sent back out to space to balance the amount of sunlight coming in. But the atmosphere is not transparent to this kind of energy. There are gases in the atmosphere that we call greenhouse gases, not the ideal acronym, or not acronym, but name, because it's not quite the same process as a greenhouse. But anyway, that's what they're called. Gases like carbon dioxide and water vapour and so on that do absorb infrared. So the atmosphere warms up as well, and it radiates energy in all directions, a good fraction of which ends up coming back to the surface of the Earth. So the Earth is warmed not only by the sun, but by the atmosphere. And it's the situation very like a blanket on a bed. That blanket captures some of the energy your body radiates and keeps it under the blanket, keeps you warmer than you would be without the blanket. And so that's the same process essentially. So a thicker blanket keeps you warmer in bed, more greenhouse gas in the air keeps the Earth's surface warmer underneath. So there are these two things going on. If you want to change the climate, you either have the sun going up and down in intensity, or the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth at least changing, or you change the amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. That's pretty much it. That explains every variation in the climate in the past that we're aware of and variations in the climate right now. So right now, sunlight isn't really changing at all. It's actually decreased slightly in the last 50 to 100 years or so. But the amount of greenhouse gas in the air has gone up dramatically. So that's the thicker blanket on the Earth. That's what's changing the climate now. We're absolutely certain about that. So that's what's going on. So let's have a look at that. So here's the thicker blanket. This is the amount of carbon dioxide in the air going back over the last 13,000 years. So the red and the green colours are measurements from ice cores in Antarctica, and the blue is direct atmospheric measurements in Hawaii from the Mauna Loa Observatory. So I show it like this, partly to illustrate how the Earth experiences this change in carbon dioxide concentration. It's in terms of the time it takes an ice sheet to melt or the deep ocean circulation to change, it's really happened in the blink of an eye. Most of the increase has actually happened since the middle of the 20th century, but industrial processes have been going on for a couple of hundred years that have caused carbon dioxide concentrations to increase like this. And the reason I bang on, and most scientists talk about carbon dioxide almost exclusively, is that this stuff stays in the atmosphere for a very long time, centuries to thousands of years. And that's why it builds up like this. Methane, which is one of the main gases released in New Zealand through agricultural processes, sticks around for maybe 10 or 15 years and then it decays away, some of which turns into carbon dioxide. That's another story. But most other gases do not stay in the atmosphere very long, but carbon dioxide does, and that's why you see this build-up over a couple of centuries or so. And left to its own devices, if there was no further emission of these gases from human activity starting right now, it would take about this long, about 10,000 years for that spike to come back down to where it was before the Industrial Revolution. So we've already changed the climate, and we've pretty much guaranteed a different climate for several thousand years into the future. And it's obviously more than 13,000 years since we've had this much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You've got to go back till before the Ice Age period that the Earth experienced for the last couple of million years. You've got to go back about 3 million years to see an atmosphere that is the same as we are breathing today. So that's beyond the timescale of the evolution of our species. So it's very much uncharted territory for humanity. So we do need, if we're going to look back to the past to get a guide to what the future might hold, we do have to look back quite a long way. And as you go back millions of years, you can see what sea levels have done and so on, but the uncertainties become quite large. So we can't say for sure. And the other complicating factor is the sorts of changes that happened in the past happened way slower than, we've increased carbon dioxide concentrations by nearly 50% in a matter of a century or so, and that would normally take probably 10,000 years or more through increased volcanic activity and so on. So it's hard to judge exactly how quickly some parts of the climate system will respond. Anyway, this is a thicker blanket of greenhouse gas on the Earth. So the Earth is warming up. There's no question about that. This graphic shows global average surface temperatures. This is from one of the main analysis centres. This is the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York estimate there's various other groups who do this, and they all get basically the same answer. And so what we see here is global temperature going back to 1880, so the last 140 years or so, and the last bar there is last year, 2018. The zero line on the vertical scale is the temperature before 1900, so this is about as good as we can get in terms of knowing what the pre-industrial was, but it's probably within 1/10 of a degree or so of the right answer there. So what we see is, the temperature bounces around, and then you see the increase really kicking in from about the middle of the 20th century. And the last 4 years have been the only years above 1 degree, above pre-industrial. So 2016 was a big El Nino year, and that's when you have an El Nino, the ocean releases heat into the atmosphere. So it's not a global warming thing, it's just the ocean cools down a little bit and the atmosphere warms up a little bit. So that's why you get a spike in temperatures during an El Nino. That's the warmest year on record so far, at about just over 1.2 above pre-industrial. But we've had 5 months of 2019 already. So if the rest of 2019 continued at the same sort of level as the year so far, 2019 would come in there. It will be just a little bit cooler than 2016. So it's looking like this year is going to be quite a jump up on 2018. And that warming trend is going to continue, basically. I mean, that's pretty much guaranteed because we put all this extra carbon dioxide in the air and so on. So the average over the last few years, we're running at about 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial. And the Paris Agreement that was signed 2 or 3 years ago now, it talks about keeping global warming well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial, and preferably, or we'll try as hard as we can to keep it only to 1.5 degrees. So we're already at 1.1, and things are warming up relatively rapidly. So time is actually quite short to meet the Paris Agreement. Well, certainly the bottom of the range there. And that 1.5 degrees, that's what the zero carbon bill is really talking about here in New Zealand. Reducing emissions quickly enough that you wouldn't warm the climate more than 1.5 degrees. And I'll talk about that towards the end. But all this, we think about air temperatures a lot because, we live in the atmosphere. But the warming of the atmosphere is a tiny fraction of what's going on. Almost all of the heating actually goes into the ocean. So the estimate is that 93% of the heating from the increase in greenhouse gases since at least the late 1960s has gone into the oceans. And one of those bottom strips there is the atmospheric warming. So good news, because if all of the warming had gone into the atmosphere, temperatures would have gone up 50 odd degrees, we would be dead, so this seminar wouldn't be happening. So that's good that the oceans are slowing down the rate of warming that we experience. Bad news is that the ocean circulation does take a long time to adjust, so we've locked in changes in the ocean for a long time. And it's the temperature of the oceans around Antarctica, which is where the oceans are warming at depth quite quickly, that determines whether the ice shelves are melting or not. So this is pushing at the Antarctic ice sheet quite dramatically. So the big question is, will we see a big loss of ice from Antarctica because of this? And the other consequence of warming the oceans, of course, is the water expands when you warm it, just like pretty much everything. So we have sea level rise. So the last 140 years, again, going back to 1880, this is the curve of global sea levels. It's a year or so out of date now, I think. But what we see there is, and here the 0 point is just taken as the global mean sea level estimate in 1880. And we've got tide gauges for all of that time, and then satellites for the last 20 odd years, and they line up pretty well in that last period. So over that time, we've had nearly 25 centimetres of sea level rise, 250 millimetres, and that line is a curve. I don't know if you can make it out. It's not a straight line. The rate of rise in the last 20 years is about 3 times the rate of rise in the first 20 years. So it's about a bit over 3 millimetres per year now. It was about 1 millimetre per year before the 1920s. And that, especially as the ice sheets start to melt more, that rate of rise will keep increasing. Speaking of the ice sheets, this is Again, it's getting to be slightly outdated. This is a graphic going through to 2017, a couple of years old now, of loss of mass from the two big ice sheets from Greenland and the Antarctic. And these are satellite measurements, actually measuring the gravitational field of the ice sheet, amazingly. As the ice melts, the gravitational pull decreases, and you can measure that. It's really incredible stuff. Anyway, so two things we can see so we've got 15 years of record there from 2002 to 2017. And the vertical scale is the change in mass of the ice sheet in gigatons, billions of tons, and it's in thousands. So 1,000 gigatons is 1 trillion tons of ice. So in that time, Greenland lost about 4 trillion tons of ice, and Antarctica's only lost about 2 trillion tons of ice. So in total, about 6 trillion tons, and there's the exchange rate at the bottom, that you have to melt 360 billion tons of ice. You spread that water out over the whole of the surface of the ocean globally, you get a layer 1 millimetre thick. So 360 gigatons equals 1 millimetre. So that amount of ice melt equals, it's less than 2 centimetres. You know, it's not actually that much. But the worry is that the rate of melt is increasing, and there's so much ice on Greenland and Antarctica that, you know, if you melted all of the Greenland ice sheet, you'd raise sea levels by about 5 metres. And if you melted all of the ice in Antarctica, including the East Antarctic, you'd raise sea levels another 60 or so metres. So I think we'd be well underwater here. But ice sheets do take a long time to melt, thousands of years to melt all of the ice off Antarctica. Again, there's a worry that we might set that process in motion, and once it starts, it can't be stopped, at least for the West Antarctic, within the next 50 years or so. So that depends on how much the ocean warms, basically. But I feel like I'm getting ahead of myself a wee bit. But anyway, let's just recap on where we're at then. So the atmosphere, as far as humanity is concerned at least, is in completely uncharted territory. We haven't experienced this air before in our history, and that's changing the total energy budget of the Earth. That's the atmosphere, the oceans, the ice sheets, etc. So everything around us is already different. Every day the temperature will be different, warmer basically than it was before. Every rainfall event, every storm is affected in some way. It doesn't mean that every day is an extreme event, but the weather is now different to the way it used to be a century or two ago. And all ecosystems, including us, are affected on every part of the globe. So, you know, this is not something that we as a civilization have had to deal with before. The climate has been very stable globally for the last best part of 10,000 years. So, and as part of that, sea levels have been pretty much static for several thousand years. So it's been okay to build big cities right by the coast. Tide's gone up and down, but the overall sea level hasn't changed. And it's been convenient to be near the coast so that you could send your ships off to wherever and trade and so on. And we all like to be near the sea. But sea levels are rising now, and so living near the coast is no longer an option, or it's not going to be for much longer. And where we grow crops, how we feed ourselves, you know, that's starting to change. Rainfall's falling in different places now and at different rates. So our ability to feed ourselves, that's changing too. And this is just something that, you know, we've never had to front up to before. So I think, you know, the future for us, at least, and other ecosystems, for the biosphere is pretty hard to read. And I think we know a lot about how the climate's changing, but we don't know everything. And I think there could be so-called cascading impacts. One thing changes, that affects another thing, and that affects another species and so on. And we just don't know. I think we're going to have to wait and see what happens in some sense. And it depends where you are as to how quickly the climate's changing, and what time of year, what kind of climate you had to start with. New Zealand's relatively well off in that respect. Our climate's quite temperate, quite variable, and we'll feel the strongest effects later than the number of other places. And the last point, so how much more change we get really depends on what we do. You know, we control the dial on the carbon emissions. It's when we choose to turn that dial down, basically. So the future then. So where do we go? This graphic from the last IPCC report attempts to summarise that. So we've got time along the bottom from 1950 to the end of this century, and temperature change up the vertical axis again. And 0 is now the temperature at the end of the 20th century. So if we adopt a low emissions scenario for the future, we're on the blue line with, you know, the uncertainty range there, and we get maybe 1 degree more warming this century. So that's the top of the Paris Agreement range. Or we're on the red line, that's the other extreme really. We just keep increasing emissions as we have done in the last 3 decades and more. And we get 4 more degrees of warming this century, plus and minus. And those two futures would be very, very different. A 4 degree extra warming from now would be starting to get into a climate that hasn't been seen on the Earth for 50 million years or more. And it would be extremely hard to deal with, putting it mildly. 1 more degree of warming would be bad enough in terms of extreme events and so on, sea level rise, but it will be much more manageable than 4. And, you know, it's completely over to us as a global community, which of those we get on, or do we even go below the blue line, or are we going to be somewhere in between? That's completely in our control. All right, so just looking at what that means, 1 degree of warming or half a degree of warming, it sounds trivial, really. But the thing to remember is that this is global average, and the global temperature doesn't change by much from year to year. 1/10 of a degree is quite a big deal. So what I've done here is a little thought experiment. That's the global record I showed before, up to 2016, the warmest year on record, but pushed into the left-hand side of the graph now. So the bottom axis goes out to 100 years from now, or 2116. Let's imagine we got 1 more degree of warming from now, or from 2016. And we had the same sorts of ups and downs as we've seen in the last 100 years. Then if I came back in 100 years' time to give this talk again, we'd be looking at something like, I'm not saying this is exactly what would happen, but it's you know, it's consistent with the sort of ups and downs you see in the climate. So it could be something like this, where the last few years, some of the years are above 2 degrees above pre-industrial, some are below, and we're averaging at about 2 degrees warmer than pre-industrial. Okay, and this is where we're at now. Well, this is where 2016 lies. It's the warmest year on record. So what that's saying is that over the next 15 to 20 years or so, there will be some years that are cooler than 2016, and then after about 2040, every year is warmer than the warmest year on record. So every year is a climate, that's a climate we've never observed before, a climate that humanity hasn't lived through, basically. So this is only with another, you know, 1/4 of a degree of warming, 1/2 a degree of warming, we move into a climate that is totally different. And that implies, again, big changes in extreme events. So as you warm the climate up, as you push the distribution of temperatures to the warm side, you start to see extremes that are they haven't been observed before. And there was a paper written by Australian colleagues a couple of years ago that was talking about this and saying that in cities like Sydney and Melbourne, you would expect to see days above 50 degrees by the end of the century with this sort of level of warming. And they already get days above 40 degrees, so it's not, you know, it's not coming out of nowhere as it were, but it would be, these would be days that are hotter than anything that's ever been observed there before. And I probably don't need to tell this audience what the sort of public health consequences of temperatures like that. This is what they're experiencing in parts of India at the moment. And, you know, it's just dangerous to be outside in those sorts of temperatures. So that would be a big deal in a big population like a city like Sydney. Maybe I don't need to show this slide, but this is just to illustrate this idea that you've got some distribution of temperatures. That's the bell curve there. The average is in the middle, the highest point. And as you shift that distribution to the right, to the warm side, the average might not change by more than a degree or so. It's still within the normal range. But the area under the curve beyond some threshold for hot days, that goes up a lot. And you start to see the very tail of this distribution, you're getting record high temperatures. You're probably also doing away with the frosts at the other end, and that may be good news, but possibly also not. Anyway, to talk a little bit about what's happening in New Zealand and finally getting on to a bit about health impacts. If for a 2 degree warming, and this is very round numbers, you get, roughly speaking, depending, you know, wherever you are, whatever you call a hot day, you'd get about 3 times as many of those in the future as you do now. In the drier parts of the country, things are becoming even drier, so you throw in a few percent less rainfall and you roughly triple the frequency of droughts, and these again are round numbers. And that would add up to, again, in the drier parts of the country, increasing the danger, at least, of forest fire dramatically. So for roughly half the year, the whole eastern side of the country, from south of Dunedin right through to East Cape, would be in either very high or extreme fire danger for, the best part of half a year, the warmest half of the year. So probably, that's a picture of the fires on the Port Hills near Christchurch a couple of years ago. You would expect to see more of those sorts of fires. Main glaciers in the Southern Alps would continue to recede, and with a 2-degree warming, they'd pretty much disappear apart from the bits right near the top of the main divide. And we would see sea level rise. As the sea level continues to rise, this is a coastal erosion event in South Canterbury that happened a few years ago. You would that those sorts of things become easier as the sea level is raised. The high tide mark comes inland quite a long way because the beach is generally relatively flat. So it becomes easier when there's a storm for these sorts of waves to intrude far enough to damage infrastructure, roads, stormwater drains, people's homes, and so on. So with sea level rise in New Zealand, we've had about 20 centimetres of sea level rise in the last century, but we've locked in already 30 more centimetres, so that's half as much again in the next 40 years. And it took 100 years to get the last 20 centimetres. So that rate of rise is increasing. And how much we get in total, or how much we get by the end of the century, that's again dependent on how much we warm the oceans mostly. At the low end, we might get 0.5 metre, which is still more than double what we've had in the last century. And at the upper end, well, it's almost, your guess is as good as mine, but at least 1.5 metres is possible by 2100, and it would keep going from there. And it depends on how much we warm things, basically. There was a series of papers published a couple of years ago looking at this. So this is just one of the graphics. So what we've got here is time, again, on the bottom, out to 2500. So, it takes time to melt ice. And the vertical scale is the contribution to global sea levels just from Antarctic ice melt. And what we've got here is the black line is essentially the Paris Agreement future, where we cap emissions very soon, and we get maybe another 20 centimetres from Antarctica. The vertical scale's in metres. If we go above 2 degrees of warming, then sometime in the second half of this century, the West Antarctic ice sheet starts to melt irreversibly, and we just can't stop it from happening. And we would get another 5 metres or so of sea level rise in due course over the next 500 years or so. If we go really hard at keeping the emissions going and we get to, say, 4 degrees of warming, that's that red line from the earlier slide, by the end of this century, then we'd kick in irreversible melting of a lot of the East Antarctic ice sheet as well, and we'd get to somewhere between 10 and 15 metres of sea level rise from Antarctica over the next few hundred years. And that red line would just keep going, and eventually you'd get to 60 or 70 metres of sea level rise. So I would rather we didn't go there. It wouldn't happen for a long time, but it could be locked in within a few decades from now. And final point on impacts, flooding. So a warmer atmosphere holds more moisture, so when it rains, you get more rain. So as well as a tripling of droughts where it's dry, there's an expectation we might see a doubling or a tripling of floods as well, which seems perverse, but both ends of the rainfall distribution are being stretched out, basically. So there's this idea, the wet get wetter and the dry get drier, which applies to parts of the world that are wet or dry, but it also applies to actual individual weather events. When you have a wet event, a storm, you're going to get more rain out of it. And when it's dry, when it's sunny, because it's warmer, the soil dries more quickly, evaporation works better, and you can get into a drought faster. Okay, now again, this audience might know more about this topic than I do, but some of the things that came out from a report that the Royal Society published, and some of the information from the Centres for Disease Control in the US, in terms of water security or water and health, you might say, As things warm up, you expect more toxic algal blooms in coastal ocean waters. More droughts, more floods would imply more contamination of water supplies. Water storage requirements become greater if you're having more droughts, depending on where you are. And just a hotter climate implies more heat stress. So if you're working outside, more prevalence of heat stroke, but also a hotter climate is implicated in all sorts of things like asthma. There's more pollen loading in the air, heart disease. The good news, I suppose, is there's reduced mortality from cold nights in the winter, but there's a lot more sort of downsides of the extra warming. And one that I personally don't know a lot about, but I've read a few papers that essentially the world's becoming a bit more tropical, and diseases and disease vectors that have been able to exist mostly in the tropics up until recently will have the facility to spread out, and exactly where they go and what happens there is a wee bit uncertain at this stage. But one of the things I think that's most important that wasn't on that previous slide is mental health effects. So as the environment around us changes, our sense of ourselves, our sense of our place changes. And I think we get into this situation of what's it called, ecological grief or stress, possibly quite quickly. I know I've read about young couples talking about not having any children because it's wrong to bring children into a world that will have major climate changes. Yeah, maybe. And so we get into this kind of grief situation. And Clive Hamilton, the Australian author, wrote a very good book a few years ago called Requiem for a Species, the species being us. That is, talking about this idea of grief, you're losing the future, having the idea the future is not as good for your kids as the present has been for you, or that we've had this idea of progress and the future's always brighter for the next generation. Well, in some ways at least, that seems to be going away. And if you want to read about this more, the Centers for Disease Control, CDC.gov in the US, and I don't know whether that's actually been taken down in the last year or so because of the federal administration, and I haven't checked recently, but I know some things I've looked for weren't there anymore, so who knows. But they've done a lot of work on all sorts of factors around how climate change can affect health and well-being. So have a look at that if you want to. All right, I've pretty much used my half an hour. So just finish off with a few words about what we started with, talking about the zero carbon bill and all the rest of it. So what do we have to do? We want to stop climate change. We need to stop this. We don't want that line going up too much higher. We're already at about 410 on an annual basis. And 350.org, which is the sort of activist group around climate change, that name comes from the idea that 350 parts per million is about the limit you wouldn't want to go beyond. We're way past that. Whether 450 is okay or not, we'll wait and see. But because this stuff stays in the air so long, it's a pretty simple calculation as to, well, how much warming do you get for a certain amount of carbon dioxide, and how long would it take to get enough in the air to get a certain other level of warming. So that much gives you about 1.1 degrees of warming. And if we just keep going as we have done for the last few years and keep emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at the present rate, we will have used up the budget of carbon dioxide for 2 degrees of warming within about 20 years from now, about 2040. And if you want to stop at 1.5, but you don't do anything about emissions, then we will have used the budget for 1.5 degrees within about 10 years. So by 2030, there will be enough carbon dioxide in the air to guarantee 1.5 degrees of warming. It wouldn't happen in 10 years. It would take another 10 years roughly to be realised. So that's where we're at. So this is why this idea of climate emergency has come around, I think. It is an emergency. We're talking a very short time. 10 years is not long. And we're talking about the global economy changing enough to reduce emissions quickly enough in a matter of just a few years. So the last IPCC, that 1.5 degree report, said if we wanted to stop at 1.5 degrees, then instead of just spending that budget in big emissions for 10 years, if you got to half the global emissions by 2030 and then get to zero by 2050, then that would be roughly equivalent to just keep poking it out, and you would stop at 1.5 degrees roughly. And that's pretty much what the zero carbon bill is talking about, getting to halving carbon dioxide emissions by 2030. Methane emissions are another story, again, because methane doesn't stay in the atmosphere so long. So from this point of view, at least, you don't have to worry about methane emissions so much. From a political point of view, maybe you do have to worry about methane emissions, but that's yet another story. And where's New Zealand at? Well, this is from the last inventory report from the Ministry of the Environment. So we've got gross emissions, that's the darker line at the top, and net emissions, that's after you subtract the amount of CO2 that trees are soaking up and so on. That's the green line lower down. But both have been increasing. Not much increase for the last few years, but gross emissions have gone up, I think, about 30% in the period since 1990, and net emissions have gone up something more like 60%, I think it is. So our emissions have been increasing, global emissions have been increasing. Again, we have to turn that around and start decreasing right now, basically. And if you go on the Ministry's website, Ministry of the Environment, you can read all about it. But the greeny side, most of the emissions from New Zealand are from agriculture. Methane, nitrous oxide, mostly. Nitrous oxide stays in the atmosphere for a century or so, and it's implicated in, fertiliser use, so it's tied up with water quality and a whole lot of things. So there's various reasons why we might want to reduce nitrous oxide emissions. But the biggest growth in emissions has actually been around on the orange side in the transport sector and in manufacturing and energy production, basically. So those are areas where I think we could make some reductions fairly readily if we chose to. So the things that are being talked about, going to 100% renewable electricity, that would reduce our emissions by several million tonnes a year. More public transport that's renewably powered, use rail rather than trucks to move stuff around. Incentivise use of electric vehicles, that could save several more million tonnes of emissions. Get industry onto renewable energy for heating and for plant power and so on. Throw less stuff away. New Zealanders are brilliant at producing waste. We're about twice as good as the typical OECD citizen. So if we could just reduce the amount of waste we produce, that would be, for various reasons, a big saver. We could put balloons on the back of the cows and send them off to South America. That would be awesome. These are just scientists measuring the amount of emissions from ruminant animals. Although I do like the idea of floating some of the cows away. Reducing stocking rates and being smarter with what we feed these guys and girls, that could reduce emissions as well, maybe not that much. But I think that the transport emissions are one that we could hit pretty hard pretty quickly. And planting lots of trees, remembering that the risk of forest fires is going up all the time. So this sort of thing could add up to a 40% reduction in emissions. This was compared to 2015 by 2030. So, we could be doing the 50% reduction by 2030 if we really wanted to. And this is all, sort of high-level stuff, government incentivising electric vehicles and everything. People ask me, well, what do I do? I think the best thing any of us can do is this kind of thing. So the school strike, Extinction Rebellion, those kinds of movements have really changed the conversation and have encouraged councils and governments and even the Pope to declare a climate emergency, and that's really shifted the conversation. So I think lots more of this stuff is, and that might include you just sending an email to your MP. We all did that, and the MP's office got 10,000 emails saying we want action on climate change. That would change the conversation. So, you don't even have to get off your couch to do a bit of climate action. And I'd really encourage everyone to think about doing something. So that's my lot. And I see well, there's 5 minutes left. Sorry about the going over time a bit, but anyway, thanks very much.
Hi, well, that was great. Food for thought. I'm sure we've got lots of questions. We'll sort of do equal ones coming in remotely and people in the audience. And I think we've got a couple of people who volunteered to run around with the mic. Where are those people? Oh, you, Andrew. Okay, sorry about you. Okay, well, first, although, do you think, Andrew, you ought to look after the remote people and Helen could look after the inside people? I think that might be better, actually. Okay, first, is there anybody to kick off remotely, Andrew? Not yet. Okay. Okay, people in the audience who would like to start the conversation. And if you could just briefly introduce yourself to those who...
I'm Jeff. I'm just wondering, thank you for pointing on all the mitigation stuff there. Regardless of what we do at the moment, the world's headed to 3 degrees, not 2, and that's pretty optimistic. I just wanted a comment from you about the balance we put into adaptation versus mitigation.
Great question.
do you think you could repeat it just in case?
Oh, yes. So the question is the balance of effort that New Zealand puts into adaptation to climate change versus mitigation. And I guess behind that question is the idea that, we emit a very small fraction of the globe's emissions. Just on the mitigation side, on a per capita basis, New Zealand's in the top 10 emitters. So I don't see we can sort of pass the buck on that. I think we have as much responsibility as anybody to reduce emissions, and we have pretty clear ways of doing that. Just a question of getting on with it, funding it, basically. But adaptation, I think that's a very good point. Sea levels have been rising for quite a while, and we've got a lot of infrastructure right by the coast, and we need to protect our ability to grow food and all the rest of it. So there is a strong case for investing in adaptation measures for sure. But I guess ultimately, if we're going to keep it all manageable, then we have to mitigate. I think that has to be the priority. And New Zealand doesn't contribute to the global scene that much, but we could still be, leading the way technologically and so on. It strikes me that from a sort of political leadership point of view, it will be good for New Zealand to be leading the world and, attracting investment maybe, and helping other countries. If we can get to zero emissions, then maybe we can sell our smarts to other countries to do the same. I'm making this up now, but I think, New Zealand has quite a lot of soft power. We're heard at the United Nations beyond our population size, and I like to think that we could be a force for good, even if we ourselves don't actually add that much to the problem. That's my personal opinion.
Yes. And if you could just identify yourself and wait for the mic.
Kia ora, Paul Bruce, our climate declaration, if you'd like a name to go with it. Hey, look, Jim, how well has IPCC dealt with feedback mechanisms? There's several feedback mechanisms that are going apace, faster than predicted. The melting of the Arctic sea, the methane levels going up, possibly because of the methane hydrates coming out, or is it just because of the fracking and the rogue emissions? Or our dairy cows. I don't think it's the agricultural ones because they're relatively static, but there's still been quite a lot of increase in fracking over the last 5-10 years. So how well have they... Does there need to be an update? It seems to me that they're not dealing with it. And in fact, we may be going much faster forward than they've predicted.
So do the IPCC reports and do the modelling groups that underpin all this, are they handling feedbacks properly? I read an article yesterday saying that the state of the permafrost in the Arctic right now is where scientists expect it would be in 2090, at the end of the century, not now. So the warming of the Arctic has been more rapid than anybody expected, I'd have to say. And so the thawing out of the permafrost and the release of methane has been faster than expected. Those, the known feedbacks are in models, I guess I can say that much. And generally speaking, they do a pretty good job of handling these things. So methane release, a lot of climate models these days have an interactive carbon cycle, biosphere, so they know about releasing methane from permafrost and changes in the ocean's ability to soak up carbon dioxide and all those things. So I think they're doing as good a job as they can, as the present understanding of the science allows. But things are happening quite quickly, and I think, we can still be in for surprises. The IPCC, the big reports that I've been involved in, the last one was published in 2013, the next one will be published in 2021, but they're putting out these interim special reports like the 1.5 degree report. There'll be one on sea level rise, oceans and ice sheets coming out in about 3 or 4 months, and then another one on climate change and land before Christmas sometime. So there is a bit of a picking up of the pace on that front. There was a workshop a couple of months ago looking at the climate model results that will go into the next big assessment report. These models are being run now, so we don't have the full suite yet, but the ones that have been done so far, it was a bit concerning, that pretty much all of the models that we have to hand right now, this is the latest generation, high resolution, better carbon cycle, all the rest of it, they all show more warming than the previous round of runs. So it's a wait and see. I'm not saying that's going to be the final conclusion in the next IPCC report, but that's the way the models are going. The latest generation warm the climate faster than the previous generation. So exactly what that means, whether we just happen to have a bunch of models that are a bit too sensitive or not, I don't know yet, but that's the way things are looking at the moment. So that's even more impetus to get the emissions down to zero as soon as we can.
Okay, and thanks very much for that
Sure.
question. That was really pessimistic, though, I'm afraid. Andrew, could you please report on a question from one of our overseas?
Sure. Annette Bolton, she says, yes, New Zealand needs to reduce emissions and sort out our sustainability issues, but ultimately this is a global issue. What can New Zealand do to influence the largest GHG polluters to also get a move on USA, China, India? ? Do we have any economic political tools? I am aware that some states are going ahead, e.g. California.
Well, great question. So it comes back to what I was saying before, and this is just my personal opinion and my hope that New Zealand we're a country that gets listened to more than you might expect for a bunch of, 5 million people in the South Pacific. And the small island states in the Pacific were some of that was the group that really pushed for this 1.5 degree business in the Paris Agreement. It was going to be just 2 degrees, but there was all this political weight put on by the small island states that stand to suffer the most from sea level rise especially. And it worked, that wording got into the Paris Agreement because of the action of the Pacific Island people and others, but largely from the Pacific. So I think New Zealand can be persuasive at least and can help other countries. If any country in the world could be completely renewable, surely New Zealand is it. We've got all the sun and wind and all the rest of it. We should be able to be completely renewably powered and we should be able to export that technology. I don't see that it has to be the Chinese who lead the world in solar technology and all the rest of it. New Zealand could be right up there. Often it's a Scandinavian country. The Danes are really expert at wind turbines and so on. There's nothing to stop us being that world expert in these things. So I think we could help other countries more than we do and be an example to other countries. But exactly how much effect that would have, I don't know. I really don't know.
I'm Russell Tregoning from Aotearoa, New Zealand Climate and Health. James, excellent again. I really appreciate your keeping us up to date. My question What do you think of the targets that this government is making towards reduction in methane by 2050? We're going to have to submit very shortly, so we need some guidance from experts like yourself.
All right. So, and well, I'll see how this goes across, but that last report the IPCC put out, the 1.5 degree report, it talked about what the globe would have to do to get to stop at 1.5 degrees. And let's see if I can do this right. Yep, there we go. So it talked about halving global CO2 emissions by 2030 and getting to zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. And at the same time, methane emissions going down by about 10% by 2030 and getting to something like 40% reduction by 2050, 40 or 50%. So because of the lifetime, yeah, methane is much more effective at absorbing energy than carbon dioxide is, but it doesn't hang around all that long. So in the long run, carbon dioxide matters more. So this government's, the bill is along the same lines. It's talking about going a lot easier on methane than on carbon dioxide. And from a scientific point of view, that's okay. But I think, to me, there are two caveats to that. You know, this really is an urgent problem, and we should be pulling out all the stops and trying as hard on all fronts as we can. And I think there's a sort of political danger to this, that, you know, it sounds like the farmers are being let off lightly while these urban dwellers are being punished by, you know, there's going to be big increases in fuel taxes or something. And I think if that, it's just a perception, I'm sure, but if that thinking becomes prevalent, you know, it sets parts of society against each other, and that's not helpful. And it's very like, I think back to the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, had this idea of Annex 1 countries and Annex 2 countries, the idea that the industrialised world were the ones who had to reduce their emissions, and the developing world, which included, you know, China, Brazil, India, etc., didn't have to do anything really because they hadn't contributed much to the problem so far. And of course that meant that the US could say, well, geez, those guys over there aren't made to do anything, so why should we do anything? And so it all fell over and nothing much really happened. And I think that's the worry with this idea that we can treat different gases differently and treat different parts of the economy differently. I totally get it from a scientific point of view, but from a social and political point of view, I wonder if it's not very smart. So I'm not going to suggest what you should say in your submission on the bill, but I think we could go harder on agricultural emissions, methane emissions, than is suggested in that bill. And I would say, well, why not? Unless there's some really strong case to say that it would crash the economy or something. I mean, I don't want to hurt people. You know, a lot of people are struggling to just feed the family and live from week to week, and you know, we don't want to seriously damage our economy for the sake of looking good on the world stage. We've got to be thoughtful about this as well as acting with urgency. So I'm reasonably comfortable with the way the wording of the bill sits in terms of methane emissions, but at the same time I would love to see things change more quickly.
Thanks very much,
okay.
and thanks for that much needed injection of the idea of a bit social justice being one part of the parameters. Could I take any more questions, or I think we've more or less run out of time? So may I just ask a couple of things on my own behalf. One is, are you happy about making your slides available if anybody wants them? Sure. Okay. Andrew, would you be able to arrange that? So if anybody does want them, if they could ask Andrew afterwards. So thanks very much for that. The other thing I just want to note is that yes, I'm aware that several organisations like Aotearoa will be putting together submission on the bill. The Department of Public Health here at the University of Otago is also planning to. We haven't got terribly far on that, and I know that our timeframes are catching up on us, but could I just note all departmental members, staff, to be ready for a draft, which will be, I hope, coming out next week sometime, just as a first bite at that. So those are my two main points. A third one perhaps is just a bit of an advertisement for another seminar, which is actually on Monday. Martin McKee is coming to talk to us. He's English, on commercial determinants of health, which may seem a different kind of topic. And of course it is, in terms of actual, perhaps immediate outcomes on the planet. But indeed, commercial determinants are relevant to climate change as they are to anything else. So it'll be a great talk. Martin is fantastic. He's a very nice and likeable person. And he will be here, it will be at 12 o'clock on Monday, a special one because he happens to be in the country. So please feel welcome to come to that as well. We'll be in a different venue, but that will be well promoted at the time. So that, with that little advertisement on commercial determinants and how they impact on planetary health and climate change, can I just say thank you very much. I have really appreciated. I certainly have been, I'm one of these people who gains most of my education on this topic from science fiction, which is often very helpful. So it's really helpful to have a bit of, hard science there as well. So thank you so much, and may I all ask us all to thank you very much. Thanks.